Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning if it's morning where you are. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, and welcome to this International Macrohistory online seminar, which today is given by Eugene White. I'm very, very happy to be able to introduce Eugene. I first met him, and I'm sure he won't remember this, but many, many years ago when I first started out doing my PhD. There was a wonderful summer school that used to be held in Venice, which was actually a gorgeous venue. And I remember being a very nervous PhD student presenting for the first time and really benefiting from Eugene's comments. Eugene is a distinguished professor of economic history at economics at Rutgers University. A long and very productive career, as you will all know, covering stock markets, booms and busts, financial institutions, and a whole raft of other things. Most recently, of course, working on this particular project, but also two other projects, again, demonstrating the versatility and productivity, currently working on projects around how unconventional policies prevented the eruption of panics in the US in the 1920s, and also on the bearing crisis of 1890, also doing other work on bank examinations as well. I'm not going to spend too much more time on introductions. I'm going to remind you that for questions of clarification, you can ask questions as we're going along, but only questions of clarification, please, while the speaker is speaking. And if you can put hashtag clarifications in your message, that would be great. For questions at the end of the session, we will have a 20-minute session of questions that come through the chat, and then there will be space for a more open conversation after 5 o'clock. But I'm very pleased now to hand over to Eugene. Eugene, welcome, and very much looking forward to your paper.
Thank you. Let me start the share screen. There we go. So, this is a kind of unusual talk to give in a macro history seminar, but it's really about how do we talk about women gender. And it's sort of encapsulated in this quote by Mary Church Terrell, a suffragist and civil rights activist, quite notable. See her picture on the lower right. Women bank presidents in the US are very rare. It is quite possible to go through a whole lifetime without seeing one. Now, I would be, let's see, trying to figure out how I advance this. And there we go. So I was a bit worried at the start last week that if I started this talk on women, Claudia might be lingering in the audience there. But as of October 8th, that worry is absolutely gone. She has better things to do than listen in. But I just want to say, on behalf of all of us, brava. I mean, she's done more for the field of economic history than many people, and the mentoring of students, colleagues, has just been absolutely wonderful. And there's, having years been advocating for her winning, it's really gratifying. So, in honor of you, Claudia. Now, how did I get started on this? Well, years ago, when I was working on my dissertation, a long time ago, I read John James's great book, Money and Capital Markets in Postbellum America. And John was a politically correct man, very careful in his use, and he referred to bankers as he and she. Now, this is kind of puzzling because in the book, there's not a single mention of a single female banker. So it got me kind of concerned, because was he righting a wrong that there had been many female bankers been ignored, or was he covering up sort of generalized misogyny in finance? Are women bankers overlooked, or are their numbers zero? And this is I found a hard question. So I did the obvious thing. That is, to deal with this question of whether you should use split pronouns and so forth, is I needed some data. So I took a manila folder, labeled it Women in Banking, and stuck it in that metal box, which we call a filing cabinet. And there it sat for nearly 4 decades, and it remains distressingly thin because there wasn't much evidence for women. So more broadly, the question is not just how we do this, but when do women become involved in the financial system? When do they become involved in management? Now, in terms of management, this likely place to go to is the Comptroller of the Currency's annual reports. These usually have a quick snapshot of the balance sheet of national banks. In 1914, there were 7,500. And on each balance sheet, it indicates who the president, that is the CEO, and who the cashier, the CFO, was. For those of you who are not among the initiated, there's been a general inflation of titles, so that you see cashier in the 19th century America, that means that's the chief financial officer. But there appear to be no women. Now, there are reports for the state's bank superintendents, but those are harder to access. There's no location, but it appeared to be very few. I've also looked at archival work on the National Bank Examiner's reports, most specifically for New York City, and which for about 3 decades and all the banks there, and there's not a single woman that I can see on the board of directors or senior management. So in terms of employees, boards of directors, shareholders, very little. On the other side, depositors and banks, it looks quite different. And there are records which record individual depositors, such as at the Immigrant Industrial Savings Bank, and show the large number of women, although we have less information for commercial banks. So in some sense, it looks in terms of management, there's not much presence of women. There in absolutes, there might be 1 or 2. So this file sat empty for decades. And then I discovered buried in one annual report of the comptroller, which are usually 300 to 500 pages, you can easily see why you overlook something, was in 1897. It provided tables that showed women's ownership, how much stock they owned in banks by state and by leading cities, and women's employment, plus their average wages. So I call these like the hidden figures of banking. And you can see the hidden figures of the space program on the right. So before beginning to get too much, we have to understand what the legal rights and legal liabilities were important. So since this is an international seminar, it's important to sort of see what the American scene is like. And at least for women had to own some stock in banks if they were to be a president or director. They had to have skin in the game in terms of that. But we want to know what may have constrained women's ownership of shares, deposits, and liabilities. Well, common law defined women as femme couverte or femme sole. Adult women defined as single, femme sole, had considerable freedom in business and making investments and controlling their property. But once married, they were classified as femme couverte, and they really didn't for a long time have a separate legal existence. Basically, they were treated like their husband, like an underage dependent child. They couldn't own property or own name or control her earnings. She couldn't sue or write contracts in her own name. And even when her husband died, a woman was not initially guardian of her children and had only the right to the dower properties. And husband might give his wife permission to engage in business, but it could also be withdrawn. And there are substantial social mores and conventions that were limited. This began to change in the 1830s as a result of the financial crises. It was rather interesting that this is the sort of event. It led states to protect women's assets from the debts of their husbands. And the most significant development was the Women's Property Act of 1848, which was considered a template for other states, where women were allowed to retain the rents and profits from real estate, personal property brought into a marriage, and could receive bequests as if she were single. Still, a woman's earnings belong to her husband. It's only about in 1855 that states like Massachusetts began to protect women's earnings from the institution of coverture. And it's quite astonishing that it's only a slow erosion or dismemberment of coverture, which goes all the way really to the 1960s and 1970s. And the final, almost before we hope it's the final sort, is the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, where it erased the need for a man to co-sign for credit applications and prohibited all kinds of financial companies from discriminating on the basis of gender, religion, or color. And the last remnant probably is in 1981, where the Supreme Court did not allow a husband to manage his wife's property without her consent. So that's the background. So in the late 19th century, women are getting more power over their assets and ability to work. So here's the basic question. Were women prominent in the banking system but hidden? Or were the few that we observe exceptions or that prove male dominance? So first, to deal with the question of exceptions or commonplace, here's two well-known women, as they were referred to, petticoats among the bovine and ursine animals of Wall Street. This is Victoria Woodhull and Tennessee Claflin. and they opened a brokerage, which was backed by Cornelius Vanderbilt. However, he had some, I'll say, conflict of interest because he had visited them frequently, and Woodhull served as a medium to speak to the spirits. But they were apparently besieged by customers. But they're one of the very few cases of women with their own enterprises in this period. Now, in addition to that, there were savings banks, but I'll say that for a moment. What about the first bank president? So it appears the first bank president was Louise Weiser, who became president of the Winnebago County Bank of Decorah, Iowa in 1875 upon her husband's death. But in typical fashion that period, once her son became of age, she resigned for him to become president. The first commercial bank president is probably Ann Martin in Texas, but the first woman to actually found a bank and run it is Maggie Lena Walker. Notable is the first she's African-American, and basically has this opportunity because of the Jim Crow laws that encourage in Virginia have separate segregated institutions. And she founds the St. Luke Penny Savings Bank, which is perhaps the most prominent of all the Black banks in the South. So these are some of the exceptions. And then there is Louisa Stevens, who succeeds her husband as president of the First National Bank, this First National Bank in Iowa. And she's claimed to be the second woman to head a bank. Now, how could I possibly have overlooked her? Well, you have in the lower right a picture of the what you see for every national bank in the comptroller's reports. For this one, for the First National Bank, and you can see her as L.B. Stevens. So very difficult to identify them, although there's a picture here of her. Now, then there are the puzzles, and there's the puzzling case of McKinley, William McKinley's wife, Ida. And before her marriage, it's reported that she either assisted her father or had been a cashier in her father's bank, but quit upon marriage. And it's very puzzling because oftentimes modern sources can't distinguish between a cashier, by which we mean usually a window teller, and a cashier who's a CFO. But she, in typical fashion, quit as soon as she was married to McKinley, and that was the end of her activities. Perhaps the most extraordinary and exceptional individual is Hetty Green. And some of you may be familiar with her. She was a Quaker, and by fortune, her family had made a small fortune in whaling voyages in the China trade. And her father, having no male heir, trained her in the business of accounting, finance, and she became the family bookkeeper. She had a modest inheritance, fought with relatives and gained more, but she moved to New York, and she became a very aggressive investor in railroads, and the railroad barons absolutely hated her. She was went to work every day, but amassed an enormous fortune. She was able to assist New York from going into bankruptcy in 1907, and her estate in 1916 was far greater than J.P. Morgan's, although it was lesser than Rockefeller or Carnegie. She became one of the wealthiest 10 people in the United States. But she never sat on the board of directors, never intervened directly. But I don't think this is to disparage much of her accomplishment, because neither did the Rothschilds sit on any boards. Now, one thing about dealing with women in this period is that they are treated rather deplorably. So I think the best comparison is between Warren Buffett and Hetty Green. She's known as the Witch of Wall Street. He is the Sage of Omaha. They are very similar. He follows the same routine every day. She followed the same routine every day. He's known as being extremely frugal. She's termed a miser. I should add, he has the same house and same car. She had rented Coldwater Flats. She wore the same dress every day. He was not fashionable. One has to remember she's a strict Quaker, and therefore there should be no attachment to worldly goods in the same way. And one of the greatest things against her was that her son was injured, and she didn't take him to a hospital, and eventually the wound led to his leg being amputated. I put a note here, because at the same time, William McKinley is shot, and the doctors actually are the ones who effectively kill him because they start investigating the wound with their unwashed fingers. So the other thing is, more importantly, both Warren Buffett and Hetty Green are aggressive value investors, very similar strategies, and they both actually saved New York City. So very, very similar in appearance. And here she is with Walter Sage and George Gould paying the first income tax in a local cartoon. Last among these exceptional ones to mention a couple, as the first woman national bank examiner, only enters the office in 1921, and then becomes actually chief of examinations. The Federal Reserve is far behind that. The first woman bank examiner in the Fed is in 1967. However, among the regulators, my favorite is Muriel Siebert. She had great difficulties trying to get on the New York Stock Exchange. She had the cash to buy a seat, but they demanded that she obtain a loan, which no one would give her for a long time, to purchase the seat. And one of the big obstacles, of course, is networking. And most of the networking at that time took place in the lunchroom, the elegant lunchroom of the New York Stock Exchange. And there was a men's room adjacent, but the women's restroom was in the next building. And Muriel Siebert, being a tough character, just said, look, if you don't open a permanent women's room there, I'm going to order a porta potty set up at the front of the lunchroom. So very difficult to break in. Most of the point of all this is that as managers, regulators, and investors, women are generally rare exceptions. You might say, what about the broader? Well, the broader thing is they actually provide a great deal of finance for the American system, and you can see that through the savings banks. Most notably, the one I've studied most is the Immigrant Industrial Savings Bank, which was founded in 1850 to promote thrift among Irish immigrants. It's an outgrowth of the Irish Immigrant Society, founded to send remittances back to Ireland in the 1840s. It was the eighth savings bank to be founded in New York. And as you can see from the slide, there are 16 savings banks, which have about a third as much as the commercial banks, but great number of accounts, and they represent much more of the general population of New York than the depositors in commercial banks. Now, at this time, there was no forms of identification, so the bank maintained what they called a test book, which had detailed personal information on each customer, what ship they came over, what county they came from, in the case of Ireland. And so we really have a complete sort of demographics database on the customers. And a database has been formed for the Immigrant Savings Bank with a 20% sample of the first 18,000 accounts that were opened in the 1850s. What this shows us is a great deal of women's contributions to the financial system. So in terms of number of accounts, men have over 9,000, women just about 6,000. Their average deposit's smaller, but still a very significant amount. And they range, they're not just small accounts, they range in size up in large size like some of the men. So you can see, again, the accounts are oftentimes slightly fewer in number, but many under $50 and many over 500 being a very substantial deposit. So very active in terms of savings. There's interesting to see how these accounts are because of the limits on married women. So no joint account. There are actually a great number of married women who have who don't have a joint account, and single and widowed. And with a joint account, there are some married. They're not always with their husband. And there's a diverse group of women, from business owners, factory workers, most commonly, of course, housekeepers, servants, and so forth, but a great variety. So a diverse, it's basically a broad selection of society in this time to fund things. Now, what did the savings banks invest in? Well, it's typically construction. Oftentimes, the brownstones were built by entrepreneurs who took loans, oftentimes from a bank like the Immigrant Savings Bank, and they made brokers loans on Wall Street. So the funds of women's savers were funded to both construction and to Wall Street. But they have no voice in management. That's absent. So one of the things I found, well, let me get on to probably the next slide. Yes. So what really drove me to try and write something up about this was the fact that I discovered in the 1897 report only once that they actually went through and looked at how many number of women shareholders, how much they held by state and by major city, and also looked at women's employment, although there's no data on men's employment for the similar period. One thing to note here is that all shares are valued at par, almost universally $100, and the prices don't vary that much from par, so roughly that's the market price. So here's some of the data here. I'm not quite sure. part of my screen is in fact blocked by our pictures, so I'm going to, I'll have to talk without seeing it a little bit. So bank stock was regarded in this period as one of the safest investments in the world to do. And so if you held $1,000 or $2,000, they're a fairly wealthy individual. Now you can see here, there are about 100,000 shareholders holding a substantial amount in cities like New York, Philadelphia, all the way down. The one notable thing here, if I can shift the pictures over, is the fact that on the frontier, it seems to be that women's participation is even greater. So here's a breakdown of the shareholding into percentage. And you'll see that, for instance, the US as a whole, women hold 36% of shares and 22% by value. Men hold about 60%, and charitable organizations and corporations, the rest, the only large concentration there is in Boston. And as I said here, what's striking, I think, is the women's holdings tend to be larger on the frontier, particularly in places like San Francisco and so forth, which speaks to the fact of the deficit of human capital, I think, on that period. So basically, women as shareholders hold between 30 and 40%, except on the frontier, and their values range between 20 and 25%. Let's see. This just looks at the distribution of shares, and so let's see. This is for New York, and you can see again very similar results. And so one of the things is the employment of women. In New York, there are 48 national banks, and there are only 18 female employees who earn an average salary about little over $600. That means that they were possibly a clerk, but most likely a cleaning woman or charwoman in the period. And there's no aggregate national data on men's earnings, but what you can see in a few cities here, what I've done is to look at the pay from National Bank Examiner's reports for the 6th National Bank of New York, fairly typical bank, of the senior officers, we don't have for clerks, and then the results for the US's total. There, I'll have to move those pictures over a bit. So there were in the US only just under 500 women employees in 1897, and their average wage is about $478. That's out of 3,600 banks. And see in New York, and all those average salaries really speak to the fact that women are not really working as even clerks, but most likely as cleaning staff. Now, so where do women systematically advance in this? Well, it turns out it's the federal government. And that I found to be quite striking as a promoter of women's employment. And it occurs, the National Banking Act, which basically sets up the modern system of banking in the US, establishes the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency in 1864 to supervise and regulate newly chartered banks. But it's during the Civil War, and there's a desperate need for clerks to process bank examinations sent to the head office. So you have bank examiners throughout the country, but you have a head office in Washington who has to process a large number of reports and information to handle correspondence. The men are off to war, so the bulk of the staff, or a great portion of the staff, are what they call female clerks. It's an official position, female clerk. The official who hired them was initially skeptical of their ability, but at the end of his career, he actually considered his greatest accomplishment to have integrated them into the Office of the Comptroller. Nevertheless, if you look at the popular press, there was all kinds of scandalous reports of the women walking on the streets freely and during the day, and of activities which may have gone on in the Treasury. But very quickly after this, the position of female clerks is abolished, and women start moving up in rank and title for the remainder of the 19th century. And I find no evidence of this occurring in the private sector. So what I'm going to show you is the next slide is the employment in the head office of the OCC. So what I've done is the annual reports report every employee, their salary and title. So you can see in 1870 here that, which is just at the beginning of this, there are, there are 42 male clerks, and 32 female clerks. all of them were classified as female clerks, actually, and men as either fourth class or first class clerks. By 1890, this has changed somewhat, substantially. The position of female clerk has disappeared, and women are in the class D, first class clerk, second class, and third class, and they represent roughly about half the employees, or the men are in the somewhat higher offices. And by the time you get to 1910, it's again, the number of clerks has increased, men more than women, but women had begun to move up, and you have one woman who is in the fourth class group. So there's a movement, there's equality. Once you have the same title, there's equality in terms of salary. Now, here's a more detailed look in 1897, the individuals, and you can see, again, they get basically parity in terms of pay as long as in the same grade. Now, again, I can find no record of a woman serving in a high-level clerk's position in any national bank, which I think is quite striking in contrast to Washington here. So the major change is this shock in there. Now, there are several questions which remain to be answered, and they include, well, was there upward mobility? Were women promoted at the same rate as men? That I'm in process of trying to figure out. And was there a marriage ban? Did women cease to work once they got married? The biggest change, however, that I know about is in 1922, those classifications, which had started in 1864, carried all the way through. And they decided that it was time to reclassify things. Technology had changed, the banking had changed. And so they reclassified. And what happened was that there were new job titles, and they could have a range of pay. And what you begin to see is actually possible wage discrimination between men and women after this grant of discretion being allowed. So that is sort of shocking to see this basically introduced later on, even as women are beginning to move into the top positions. So, let's see if I can. So the final word, I guess, on gender pronouns for the 19th century is that women held significant stakes in many banks and were apparently as passive investors. There's very little, I've seen no record of any women sitting on the boards of directors, or very rarely in managerial positions, except if they've inherited the position from their husband. Their holdings tend to be in banks smaller than men, but it's only on the frontier that women basically took managerial positions. Most of those women I introduced in the beginning as being exceptions are out on the frontier where there's a scarcity of talent. And the government agencies appear to be the first ones who really provide broad opportunities for women to rise up, at least to a certain level of expertise within regulatory agencies. So back to the first question, back to John James's question is, what pronoun should one use? And I think it's awkward because in terms of talking about bankers and management, it's a little misleading to be he and she. And I think what we have to do is be careful with our, deal with that explicitly and explain that as far as we're concerned, there may be one or two women, but generally it's a male-dominated profession. That's not true in terms of talking about women's investments, because clearly they were involved just as much. And with due respect to work done on the 18th, 17th, and 18th century, we know that women invested very heavily in the British stock market. So this is something of continuing use. So the real problem is that women had no voice in the actual disposition of their funds and how they were invested once they deposited them or bought stock. So that's sort of a preliminary study and pushing away to see exactly how and when barriers to women's employment disappeared in the US.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. That's incredibly stimulating and really, really interesting stuff. So we're open for questions in the chat from everybody. And
Should I stop share?
I'd suggest you leave it up just in case colleagues
Sure.
want to go back to particular slides. I guess I get to kick off and abuse my position as chair by asking the first question. And I wanted to ask, so you mentioned women's shareholding. and the occasional woman who was in higher levels of ownership, etc. I've just been reading a very interesting book by Niccolo Valmori on politics and banking at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. One of the points that is made in that book is women's influence over banking. So there's sort of formal and informal influence through patronage, through political connections, through the kind of salon conversations. And I wonder whether that's been part of the project and whether you see any influence from women in those ways.
So that's a very hard thing to do, because that really relies upon individuals. I've been reading a book called The Women of the Rothschilds by Natalie Livingston. And it's fascinating because they do exert enormous influence, at least in England, in the political sphere, but some of them actually directly handle their own investments very substantially. But that's something which has been heretofore invisible. You only see the men operating in their main offices, but some of them became quite wealthy and invested on their own half. So a lot of this is, there's no basically easy access to some centralized archive where you could actually pool this together. But it appears that, wealthy women were substantial investors for a good period of time. The problem was actually then deciding how the funds, whether invested in stock, how the companies would be directed and so forth. That's I think the real gap.
Yeah. The other really interesting point was you called Hetty Green an aggressive investor, which I thought was an interesting choice of words there. And I'm kind of reminded of 2008, 2009, and that sort of famous quote: "If Lehman Brothers had been Lehman Sisters, they wouldn't have ended up in the trouble they were in." And I would really, I'd really be interested in challenging that whole idea that women are more cautious, less risk-taking. What is your view? What have you ended up?
What I've done is, most of what I've read are stuff which just comes out of the National Bureau of Economic Research, and the general view is that women are more conservatives, perhaps a wrong term, less risk-taking in the extreme. The crypto world is much more inhabited by crypto bros than crypto sisters. We know this. And I think that's maybe have to do, maybe have some of their gender. But Hetty Green is a very interesting person for the amount of garbage that was dumped on her head. One of the things I try and encourage my students to do when they're looking at large panels is go see what was said at the time. And I was looking a little bit, just all the articles in the Times on Hetty Green, and it was her 70th birthday. And it's a faintly favorable article, but it describes her going into her office. Most of the time it says she just went and had a desk. Well, she had an office in a brand new skyscraper, which was right next to Trinity Church. It was the most modern building, had an elevator. She had obviously several rooms in this office where she was able to slam the door on the reporters. The reporters came in with such wonderful question as, do you eat onions in order to increase your longevity? And, she was just annoyed as anything. There was a stack of coupons to be clipped on her desk, and she just slammed the door in their face and just went on her business. But it was generally seemed to be harassing her more than anything else. And yet at the same time, extremely savvy investor to have piled full funds, and actually have been a great charitable giver as well. So I think it's very important to look at the actual evidence of where they are. It took a long time to find out where she had her offices. And having realized this, the building still exists, and it's a very handsome building. So it's not as though she was some crazed miser. No, she was a very rational investor, much like the Sage of Omaha in many ways, in many characteristics, except that as a woman in this period, you could criticize her for not dressing the right way, not doing this or that. And I think that's certainly the case. It's also very difficult until even in the early 20th century for women to freely move around town by themselves. And that's a real limitation on their ability to carry out activities in any economic sector. There's, for instance, going to a restaurant would be regarded very poorly if you're not accompanied by a male. So these are all kinds of various social constraints on the ability to actually become a manager.
Yeah, thank you. So we've got a couple of questions up in the chat, and obviously I encourage more questions to come in as well. The first is from Melis Avaro, and she's asking if you can go back to the tables about the state variations in women's shareholdings.
Okay.
And she's noting there that Delaware is a bit of an outlier.
Yeah, let me just go back to the screen share here. And
so that one, I think, yeah. So she says, Delaware is a bit of an outlier. Do you have any idea why?
That it's roughly equal between men and women. No, I don't. This may be the DuPont family. It could be very likely the DuPont family. One of the questions which is hard to get a grip on is whether women purchased the stock on their own or whether they inherited it. Because you can easily build a model where, where in fact there's some couple which have only female descendants and they inherit the money and so forth. And you might actually come close to getting 30% of the shares being held by women in that kind of world. But those outliers, I think that probably reflects the DuPont family. And if you were to see for that one, for the state of Delaware, which is small, if you could track the holdings of the DuPonts, you could probably explain a good portion of the difference there.
Mm-hmm.
But that's pretty much the exception. Then you have Mississippi, where in fact it's much more extremely divided, and Colorado, where men dominate the case, but that may be the mining companies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. And then there's a question from Simon Wegg. Were the first names of the CEO and the CFO were abbreviated in the 19th century records? So that the example that you pointed out, where there's just the initials, is that common? And would it have been preferable to do so to hide the fact that such an officer was female, similar to what female writers might do, for example?
Well, they did tend to abbreviate names, but they weren't always abbreviated to one letter. So you might see J.O., which you would assume would be Josiah or John or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But abbreviation letters was common, but it would certainly hide the identity, whether male or female, which might be desirable to prevent any bias in terms of buying the stock in that company or so forth. Although the bank examiner would know. The bank examiner would know it's male or female. And in the bank examiner's reports to Washington, you would see the full name. And they oftentimes would give also the occupation, address of the director, and the shares held and how much they borrowed from the bank as well. So you have a full picture that way. And actually, those sorts of reports give a much greater sense in terms of the governance of banks than others. But again, there are very few, at least in New York, and certainly elsewhere, women directors, which is surprising. But why that's the case, it's hard to know if they own 30% of the stock nationwide. Mm. And that, I think, would be very interesting to figure out why that was the case and when that began to break down.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Rui, I think you get to have moderator's privilege and ask your question in person.
Thank you. Happy to abuse it. So thanks so much, Eugene, to bring your super interesting project. It's really path-breaking, and thanks for persevering all these years and digging the record. So I have two questions. You partly alluded to them, but so this is essentially me being curious how much progress you've been making on them. So the first one, the distinction, if I can make between women as investors and women investors, right? Active versus passive, right? So you mentioned some obvious self-selected case of very savvy women investors, but they're super self-selected, right? So immense amount of positive
They're the exceptional ones, not the exceptions.
Exactly. So do the records, archival or regulatory, allow us to get some inroad on whether there's a gender difference in the type of investments in the investment strategy that American women, when they actually controlled their estates, were doing, related, to similar research done by Jeanette Rutherford on her own samplings of, female investors in the London Stock Exchange. And the second is on the, what was blocking advancement, not at the managerial level, but at the clerk level in private banks, right? So you told the story of the federal government. That's where, things progressed first. And you mentioned Claudia Golden. So I immediately was reminded of the pollution theory of discrimination. Was it this because men didn't want it to be mixed up with women in this type of occupations where advancement depended on unobserved skills? Was something else? Is there evidence of more active discrimination, or
lots of good questions. The one thing which we do know is that in the federal government, there are three big pushes which increase women's employment: the Civil War, the First World War, and the Second World War. And they each advance women. There's some retreat afterwards, but not complete. And so those are big shocks which move it forward. The question for me is, how does that affect the banks? Because they should be suffering the same deficit.
Yep.
And yet it's very hard. I have one student who's actually working on World War I and banks in New York to see if it makes some difference. She does find that women get some employment then. Probably not in the 19th century. And I do think that probably this pollution theory does explain a lot, especially in smaller institutions. Banks are not large corporations for the most part. They're fairly small and tightly held. And you can see that in those sorts of circumstances, it's much harder, I think, to gain entry for someone who's either a minority of any kind. And usually the result was the establishment of a separate institution run by them. So you have, for instance, investment banks, you have old school establishment banks, you have Jewish banks and so forth. But it may have been very difficult. Again, certainly, to my knowledge, the federal government nor the states chartered banks specifically for women. The one case where you do see that in the 19th century, the early 20th century, is in terms of the segregated South, particularly in Virginia, where they decided that you had to keep blacks out, and not only black, but also anyone with a, it's hard to pick the language, but whether you describe as mulattoes, having their own separate institutions so they wouldn't pollute the white institutions. And they really did encourage the establishment of black banks. So you see that, but there's no effort I can see anywhere to have separate women's banks. In fact, I think that only happens in the 1970s.
And
that's
women,
a partial answer to some of those questions.
Yeah, and on women as investors?
So women as investors, a different investment strategy. It's, again, you need to have very detailed information, and that's hard to find. You can find it probably, for instance, the Rothschilds. You can probably find it for any of the heirs or heiresses of the major fortunes. But on average, I think you'd have to look at probate records in order to find out exactly. And that's a lot of intensive work. I can only think of the work of a very prominent woman historian who wrote on the wealth of a nation to be, the records of colonial America, to try and find out what wealth was, and going through every single probate record to try and reconstruct that. Alice Hanson Jones, wonderful work, but extremely difficult. So to do that, you'd have to find some way to access, say, probate records or something else which gives you a reasonable sample of the of men and women in order to reconstitute that.
Thanks.
I say that in part because I've actually been working on a relatives probate case where everything has to be laid down and specified with great clarity, the shares, the amount, and so forth. So there's the information would be available in that sort of situation.
Yeah. There's also quite an interesting book from by Amy Freud called Silent Partners, but for an earlier period, and for the British case for female investors. But there's some quite interesting stuff about motivation and appetite for risk in there as well. So we have further questions on the chat from Clemens Jobst. So what is the benchmark? What is the proper benchmark for assessing whether the share of women in shareholders is high or low? When you said that women often can't or don't invest for themselves, but only as part of a joint household. So are numbers in the 30s not very high, or are they high?
I say that numbers in the 30s are fairly high because it represents they're registered as an owner in their own right and not as the man taking over their estate and investing their funds. And it's what's striking, actually, looking at the Immigrant Savings Bank, is the number of married women who have accounts in their own name. Because I'm not, that time it wasn't quite settled whether that was they could actually act on their own even if they were married. So I think this is really, when you look at the percentage of women shareholders, that's in their own name. And I think that is significant. And you can see a great deal of variation, and explaining the variation, I think, will illuminate it a bit more. And that's a task. But again, the deficit of data, it takes a long time to pry out the information to make some sort of actual judgment about that. What's, for instance, striking in St. Louis, the women hold very few shares relatively to the number, to the shares held by men, very small amount. And the South generally seems to be lower than the North, which says something about we think that discrimination against women was somewhat greater in the South in general, and that appears to be held out by the lower shares they hold. So there's some regularities here.
Yeah, thank you. Tony Moore is asking, looking at the varying shares held by corporations, could these have been used for female shareholders similar to trusts? It looks like female holdings are lower where corporate is higher.
The corporations, I know about the corporations, not from the source here, but from the against the bank examiner's reports. That will report the shareholdings of the largest, often the largest shareholders, and you'll see these are usually charitable organizations. They're not trusts, as far as I've seen. And it's not surprising that, that I guess Boston has a very high percentage of that, because there are lots of charitable organizations, much more elsewhere. But I don't think it really is a standard, and Maine too. So New England is distinctly different for this, is that there are a lot more organizations, for instance, even universities, which may be holding shares in banks.
Yeah, thank you. Interesting to explore, I suppose, women as trustees of charities as well. And maybe
yes, that's true. That's possible, yeah.
So to give you a break from answering questions about shareholding, Stefano Bettillo is asking about women's participation in the financial workforce. So is banking representative of a general situation in business, or did it create specific obstacles to women's professional progression due to maybe specific gender issues in banking intermediaries, etc.? I hope I've interpreted that question right, Stefano. Correct me if I didn't.
So the right reference to go back to is compare women in banks to the general clerical workers, and the work, of course, that goes to Claudia Golden's work on the gender gap. And what you see there is that when you move from factory work or agricultural work, women have a greater opportunity in terms of clerical work to move into the workforce. And so there's part of a general trend that opens more access to women, although there are more formalized barriers. But this should be properly placed within the clerical sector as well. However, of course, there are limits, because when you move up high enough in a bank, you're not just talking about ordinary clerical work, recording deposits and changes, things like that. You're talking about investments. And that seems to be an area where they're more excluded from their activities, since they don't rise up to the level of management, even in the regulatory sector. I should add one thing, and that is in 1990, I wrote a history of the comptroller of the currency for the agency. And I had the privilege of talking with the first deputy comptroller who was a woman. And that was very illuminating, because she talked about her whole experiences. And the one story she said, this was during the commercial banking crisis of the 1980s, and she was in charge of the district, which included Texas. And she had a Saturday morning meeting with some of the local bankers there. And they were in the elevator, and one of them turned to her and said, "Ma'am, you sure do like them charts and numbers, don't you?" So very much an old boy network versus a sort of modern, maybe more business administration sort of view of an approach, but also giving you an idea of really, I'm sure there weren't many women in those banks too. So it was quite a shock for them to have to deal with a female regulator.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Even in the 1980s.
Yes, I remember banking in the 1980s. Being a woman in banking in the 1980s was a shock to many people. I'm going to add a supplementary question.
The other thing about that is there's a change. For most part, for most of these banks, what happened is that if you would start as a clerk, even if you came from a well-to-do family, and slowly work your way up in the firm, because they prized the specific knowledge to that bank. The big change comes with the introduction of the MBA, because now your skills are portable, and that allows for the introduction of many more minorities and women. And that's the big revolution, even from the 80s onwards, as you witness. Before, it's not just an old boy network, but all the skills are basically start at the bottom level, and you have to move your way up.
Yeah, that was going to be my supplementary question, but of an earlier period. So to what extent we see women clerks moving into banking in the sort of 1890s onwards? To what extent is their education fitting them for those roles?
Well, it's interesting because, again, I have to draw on Claudia's work about education, that for most of the 19th century, an 8th grade education represented the highest level you would obtain. The revolution in terms of high school, particularly being in the 1920s, allows more women to attain a much higher level of skill. And that's when you begin seeing them taking many more jobs in not just the clerical sector, but the white collar sector, because now they have portable talents and they're certified with a high school degree. We don't think of this as being important, but very important, because now they can be rated with men on the same by the same test. It's not just how much you learn from being on the job, and so I think that makes a big difference as well. And I mean, my aunts both started out as tellers in banks, having finished high school, which tells you a great deal about the transformation.
Yeah, and a tough job being a teller as well.
Yes, and very, very unlike today, you weren't allowed to lead unless your drawer added up.
Yes, yeah, indeed. Nathan, again, you get the privilege of asking your question in person.
Hi, Eugene. Really enjoyed the paper. I mean, it's more of a suggestion than a comment on what you presented, but I don't know if you're probably aware of the paper by Hazan et al. On women liberations, financial revolution in England that appeared in the Journal of Finance a couple of years ago. And I think that, with your data, you can do something similar along the veins that they investigate and hopefully get a publication in Journal of Finance.
Okay.
But this is England and this is the United States, and it will be interesting to see if there are any comparisons or any kind of predictions from what they have found that carry over to the United States.
In addition, the speed of mobility, as whether different societies, other restrictions as well.
So
okay, that's a good suggestion. Very good.
Yeah, that could be, because then you can leverage this into some kind of do some econometrics, some kind of because you have all this great data, and I think it lends itself very easily to the kind of stuff they're doing.
It's what's really frustrating is that they published this data for 1 year, and they must have done it for other years as well, but it was never published, and somewhere perhaps in their archives. But I've used the comptroller's archives extensively, and I have never seen anything quite like this. What's interesting, and this is just in terms for younger researchers, I mean, I've only went to archival work later in my career, but it's surprising what you see. Sometimes you'll see tempting things. It is said that national bank examiners examine banks twice a year. And of course, taking that at face value, I thought, okay, it's regular, whatever. I found tally sheets, which showed if they'd been done on time. They lagged. Sometimes there were dozens of banks which hadn't been examined in a year. They were so you can see that the regulators are very frustrated in trying to carry these out. That's very different than that. And so usually these even snippets of information are very helpful for understanding exactly how, for instance, the system was regulated or who's in charge of banks and so forth.
And is that an active resistance to being examined, or is there a risk-based system?
Actually, what's interesting is I used to think of this as a examination as a subsidized audit. And that many bankers actually welcomed this. And occasionally they would complain that the examiner was not up to snuff. There were a group of Philadelphia bankers which at one point said, the guy isn't doing a good job. He missed the weakness in this bank and it caused all of his problems. That's very different than we think of it today as an completely adversarial. There's some adversarial, but it also, and that this is the work I've done on examiners, they provide one of the, I think, few, you can look at, for instance, what the clearinghouse does, you can look at the stock market, you can look at the other information, but really it's the examiner who gets to walk through the bank freely and examine people and talk to them, then meet with the board of directors who has the best insights as to the strength of the bank as well. And I presented some preliminary research at some of the Federal Reserves, and the response usually is, those guys were much tougher than we are because they had more discretion.
Right.
And discretion, the rules and discretion are one of the big divides in terms of how you charge your regulatory agency. And so, again, then that raises the question, did the regulators put any pressure on banks to hire or not hire women? And I don't see any evidence of that either. But certainly the really striking thing is how early on the women are accepted into Washington, D.C. And that, again, like almost every other occupation, you notice that minorities oftentimes find the first better employment with the government in the U.S.
Yeah.
They can't find a job in the private sector. Usually the federal sector provides a position first.
Thank you. That almost brings us to the end of our hour. And then I know we have space after this for a more informal conversations. So if colleagues can stay for a further sort of 15-20 minutes or so, then we will have an informal conversation. Might I ask one final question, just out of curiosity? Was Victoria Woodhull engaging with the spirits when she was giving out her financial advice, or was that a sideline?
I don't know. I mean, this is it was regarded as scandalous, their activity, but they apparently had lots of clients. Men enjoyed going in and talking with these two very fashionable, obviously from their pictures, slightly flirtatious women. They were happy to get in their business. And if Cornelius Vanderbilt says they're solid, they might well be. So, I think, would they have done as well if they had been a little more, as the old phrase says, dowdy? I doubt it. They had to advertise in a certain way, and that was the way they did it. They're just to go back. You can see these are these would not be the photographs of a conventional woman of the period.
Yeah, well, admirable of them, absolutely.
Yes.
So this brings us to the end of the formal part of the seminar. I am first to remind you of the next seminar, which is on the 25th of October. Dror Goldberg will be talking about deception through credible commitment, secret inflationary finance in Israel's war of independence. And Dror is from the Open University of Israel. So you'll be able to join us for that on the 25th of October. And finally, just thank you to Eugene. Wonderful, stimulating paper covering so much ground, so much of interest. And I very much look forward to seeing how the project progresses.
Well, I hope it stimulates other people to look at the many hidden figures. I mean, there's a lot of information, but it's really buried, and you have to just begin to dig it out. And there's a lot of fascinating stuff, which has a lot of bearing even on contemporary issues.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'm presuming something magic happens that then allows people who are still in the participants area to speak?
No, but we can unmute them if they so want.
Okay, right. So if there are any participants who would like to speak and maybe offer comments or more detailed questions that you can put in the chat, let us know and we can unmute you there. I think we'll just put an indication up in the chat there. So otherwise, any other questions, Rui or Nathan, that you had?
There's two questions from Clemens Jobst. Did I miss you?
No, we asked those.
Okay, all right. So because you had the second one. Yeah.
Yes, we asked. I think we asked both of those. No, we did ask both of those.
Okay.
And I would say, there's a number of good recent books on women in banking, and a copy of the Women of Rothschild World is very interesting. It's not organized in a way which answers questions we're concerned about, but at the same time, you get a flavor that, for instance, many of them became important investors due to their inheritance. And so I think, a lot of biographies are good. Reading these biographies are a good way for thinking about how women participated in the financial system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So another Claudia Goldin inspired question, credentialization, right? So initially high school, later, much later, higher degrees. So
Yes.
Were there specific qualifications, certified qualifications that were necessary to reach the several levels in the pecking order of these banks? Was it more?
Well, the one thing is, in banking is, for most of the 19th century, it's all on-the-job learning. You start out as a clerk. I mean, you might start in the mailroom, for that matter, and slowly move up. What would be required is good penmanship. Yeah. That's absolutely essential, and that's I guess you would learn in your first 8 years, whether you had it or not. And you can see, it's interesting to see how much education people have. I saw, and this is very personal, but I saw my grandparents, my paternal grandparents' marriage certificate, and the difference in their handwriting told you a great deal about the levels of education. Mm. My grandfather's was very elegant. My grandmother's was difficult. And I think, she would never have been able to be a clerk. He would have, okay, you can write, you have a good hand. That's one of the first requirements. And that's very basic. The rest they figured they could teach in the firm and gradually move up. I mean, people failed at, they might have, stolen a few dollars here and there, be thrown out or whatever. But for a long time, until really the early 20th century, there's very, even I think college graduates in the 19th century had to start out at the bottom and work their way up. There was no jumping into a job ahead of the head clerk at a bank or something like that. So it's really with I think the advent of high school, where there's enough teaching, even of some basics of accounting and so forth in there, that gave credentialization, which allowed people to select a larger number. And also, you get banks which are getting larger. So you have they're much larger institutions. They have more workers. You have to deal with the fact that you have a more diverse workforce, and you are going to use this credentialization to a greater degree. Yeah.
So there's a question in the chat, which is a question I was going to ask as well, which is the importance of the skill of numeracy. So the Bank of England, right from the start, was certainly testing penmanship. But also testing the ability to add columns of numbers and also to tell money as well. So the applicants were given piles of money and they had to compute how much was in the pile, and they really struggled with that. So back to Simone's question, what about the important skill of numeracy?
I think that's very important. The penmanship is easy to see, because that you'll see immediately there. But numeracy is important. One of the things in looking at all these examiners' records, I've looked at several hundred, maybe 1,000 bank examinations. And what I had my students tote up the very long balance sheets, much longer than the printed ones. There's never been an error. We've never uncovered an examiner's error, which is extraordinary. And that speaks to the fact that these men, because that's who the examiners were, had to be highly numerate. They had to have a very clear sense of that. And I think that errorless is there. So they put a great weight on being precise. In fact, banking examinations focused on precision all the way up till about 1970. And it's only then that began to worry more about whether they're managing, more, we'd say, soft sort of information being more important. But that they knew they could quantify.
Are there, and I think this is really difficult to track down though, are there day books, rough books of initial calculations or initial notes, and then the final ledger where the kind of the perfection is presented?
We are all beneficiaries of our good graduate students. And I had one in history who had a nose for records. And he found in the archives of Columbia the preliminary notebooks of one examiner.
Really?
And what's striking there is they sketch in the numbers real quickly, but the notes, what they do is they temper their comments in the final. The ones or their true opinion, which is really striking. And this one preliminary notebook actually was a bank examiner who became the comptroller of the currency. So it's a very prominent individual. But and in fact, the preliminary notebooks were pre-printed by the comptroller and given to them as to their valuations. And one of the things is trying to prize out, for instance, how diligent were they and so forth. Well, I can see the timing when they sent it in the reports, when they were read in there. So I have a sense of how well this institution's being managed. But this is really pulling things out of the system as well. I think that one of the things in terms of teaching numeracy would be very interesting to know what the composition of high school courses were. And those are usually set by the state standards. And there you have, well, do the state standards then influence the uptake of women, say, to the banking system? That would be a valued approach to the problem. So yeah. that's a good idea to come out of the discussion, I think. Yeah. But high school does make a huge difference. Mm-hmm. They even teach foreign languages, shockingly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So maybe we could unmute Caroline. So Caroline Folin has a data point for you.
Yes, Caroline.
Caroline?
Hi, Eugene. This is so fascinating. I love this. I was just wanting to give you one data point, which is my grandmother, born in 1902, who lived in Worcester, Massachusetts. And I don't know her education, but I know she didn't go to college. I don't know if she went to high school, but she was the bookkeeper and accountant for the big local department store in the 20s and 30s. And she actually kept her unemployed husband and son fed during the Depression as a accountant, bookkeeper.
Wow.
So she was definitely numerate, and then ran a business in her quasi-retirement in the 50s through the 70s.
Yeah, strong women keep families from falling apart, especially in the Depression time. That's like what's striking about the 1830s, is it's a time of crisis. And one way I think they are willing to allow women to have separate inheritances is because it protects the family by not having the father's debts being charged against the whole family's funds. And I think that's that's a very important development. I mean, there's very other, I don't know how else you would explain this development at the same time you have the financial crisis. But
yeah, I was wondering that too. I thought that was kind of like, because women couldn't vote, so it was men voluntarily giving up, so to speak, some power over women. So that was kind of notable. Well, anyway, I hope you, when you portion this out into papers, I hope you will look at Financial History Review as an outlet, because I think certainly. It's fascinating.
It's a good outlet for a lot of work. Yes, it certainly will. Thank you, Caroline.
Nice sales pitch as well.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
And I think actually Caroline's point is that we always tend to pretend that we're wearing white coats and stethoscopes around our neck, but family histories oftentimes illuminate things as much as any other. And I'll tell, since Caroline is grandmother, my paternal grandmother had a fourth grade education. She was the one who carried the family through. And after she realized that Social Security might not be enough, so she invested in blue chip stocks, AT&T, in the 1940s and 50s. How to explain that's quite difficult, but obviously acquired enough knowledge to do that. And as I showed my sons, her investments paid for a quarter of their college education. So these are make important things. And so even if you don't have all the education, you might acquire it by just talking to your friends and neighbors. So,
yeah. In terms of women's employment, are you able to get down to sort of particular institutions? And once institutions start to employ women, do the number of women accumulate?
So I think that they do. It's frustrating look at the examiner's reports because they only usually mention the top officials, so you can't see what's happening below. The alternative is to go through the census, but the census, the people are going out and doing the interviews, taking in the enumerators. The enumerators oftentimes have their own way of describing. They vary a great deal from whether you describe someone who's working in a bank or they might just say a clerk, and yet you can't tell the difference. And so that's very frustrating. And the quality varies quite a bit. People who work for the census see that much more. But it is possible to, for instance, to obtain a certain amount of information on that. And I guess with maybe AI, it might be even better. You might get a little bit more information, be able to extract from there. But you have to use, I think, the census in order to find out exactly how rapidly women progress within certain sectors, unless they're carefully recorded.
Yeah, and that's a big job, I'm guessing.
Yes, it is.
Just out of curiosity, I mean, did you look at any women being employed at the OCC, at the Office of the Controller? When did that start, if at all?
Well, it starts in 1864 because the men are all off to war, so they have to hire women. They're
so there are women
clerk.
in the office, and so that doesn't reflect some kind of. I mean, obviously, these are skills. These are skills that could be used in the banks themselves. So, isn't there like revolving doors or any one of these things?
That's a good question. We've tried to find these women in the census to see what their backgrounds are, and it's difficult. I thought, well, this should be easy because it's Washington D.C. It's a small town, as they say, and it's still hard to match them. And you'll find some cases where a young woman is living with her father. She's the support of the family and she works in the office. There are a few MRSs, women who have their MRS degree, as they used to say, working there. So it seems that Washington's a very liberal, flexible place. The Civil War is a very potent maker of change because it's not just the OCC, but the Treasury Department, other big departments had to hire more women. It even occurred in the South, in the Confederate States, that the Treasury there was involved with women. So whether whether men replace the women more in the South than the North is another question to look at, to see how this develops, whether in fact, the acceptance of women is more permanent in one region versus the other. So there are lots of questions. I suspect it's less so, but it's not easy to see. It does change attitudes, which is important. It does change some of the social norms because their work is considered vital and get a certain degree of respect for it. But that's the first time. Before the Civil War, there are scant women. Well, the federal government isn't very big. And most institutions aren't. So you have a male lock on virtually every type of enterprise.
Yeah, it's interesting. The role of war, I think, in advancing women's employment and women's rights, I think is extremely interesting and well documented, of course. Ruby, any final questions from you before we close?
No, I think we're done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's been very helpful, and I'll chase down some of the comments. And as I portion this out, thank you very much for allowing me to give a preliminary sort of work presented. This is trying to figure out how to put things together in a bigger picture, which is useful in general. But it's been a lot of fun.
Thank you. Thank you, Russ.
Thank you all.
Yeah. Thanks, Anne. Thanks, Eugene.
Thank you, Anne. Thanks, Eugene.
Thanks very much. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.